So pretty recently we got a slew of updates for the big extraction shooters on the market, Hunt Showdown, which got rebranded into Hunt Showdown 1896 with its big update, as well as Escape from Tarkov getting an update and of course subsequent wipe that had people going back to it. But there was another game that got an update right around the same time called Marauders, which I hadn't taken a look at in quite a long time. The last time I had taken a look at it was shortly after it had released into early access back in October of 2022, and it seemed like a decent time to jump back in and give it another try and see how things had progressed since I had originally taken a look at it. And with the way the game is currently, I really wasn't able to do a proper assessment of it and really see how things have changed, because most of what they have added is stuff that you really need to work your way towards. There hasn't been really anything added to the early game experience. Although they did at least add in the Raider mode, which is their version of Escape from Tarkov's Scav mode, where you are given a random set of equipment and just thrown into the match, and you have a limited amount of time to go around, loot stuff, fight other players or AI, and then escape. But due to certain major issues with the general gameplay loop, I really wasn't able to see what kinds of changes have been made, and as I explain this all further, you'll start to understand why. So, the thing about extraction shooters is that they vary pretty widely. There's the kind of paragon of the genre, Escape from Tarkov, which obviously has been in some hot water lately. So there has been kind of a surge of extraction shooters coming up and trying to take up some of the audience that was moving away from Tarkov. Stuff like Arena Breakout Infinite, or Gray Zone Warfare, or the entirely single-player and co-op Incursion Red River, and to a lesser degree, since it's in a completely different setting, A Twisted Path to Renown. There's also other types of extraction shooters and extraction action games, with the biggest among them being Hunt Showdown, or now Hunt Showdown 1896 as it's known, or Call of Duty Warzone's DMZ mode, or Dark and Darker was pretty popular on Twitch a couple of years ago, and it's still around. There's a couple of other ones as well, and you get the idea there. The point is that there are some varied experiences to have within the extraction shooter or extraction action game subgenre or subtype, I guess it would be better to say. And there are a set of issues that are common to nearly all of them, if not outright all of them. Now, the first issue you're going to run into, especially if you're a new player trying to jump into these sorts of things, is a gear disparity. Now, this is worse in some games than others. In a game like Hunt Showdown, for example, it's not as big of a deal. Especially now that they've implemented the mechanic of any headshot, regardless of what weapon you're using, will instantly drop another hunter. Sure, you might be somewhat outclassed in a particular gunfight depending on what you're using versus what the other players are using, but generally speaking, the gear you're using is more of a matter of preference than anything else. On the other end of the spectrum, where gear is incredibly important, you have games like Escape from Tarkov, or the example that I'll be using in this video, Marauders, where if you get into a fight with someone who has higher level gear than you, then you're at a significant disadvantage compared to them. Now, in Tarkov, there is still some room to maneuver. Even if you have low-level weapons, depending on what ammunition you're using, and depending on shot placement, you can still get around how good their armor is. If you're shooting into the gaps of their armor, for example, or if you're using a low-level weapon, but the ammo you have for it allows it to kind of push beyond its real weight class, then you can still manage to win gunfights, and especially if you get the drop on somebody, you can still manage to get out of a gunfight okay. This is, of course, because Tarkov leans more into the realistic simulation side of things. But then you have games like Marauders, where if you're a low-level player going in with low-level gear, which means you're running in with submachine guns and pistols and maybe a shotgun, you have basically no chance against those higher-level players, because Marauders doesn't have the same kind of realistic simulation elements to it, so you can't just shoot into the gaps of their armor or anything like that. And since there's no special ammo types or anything like that, your weapons simply aren't capable of penetrating their armor, so you can sit there and waste entire magazines on them and they'll just be perfectly fine, while they'll turn around and shoot you maybe 2 or 3 times and you're dead instantly because their weapons are going to treat your armor like it's made of tissue paper. There are clear delineations between high-level gear and low-level gear. The low-level gear is only capable of dealing with other low-level gear, whereas the high-level gear is capable of dealing with everything. And while I haven't played a ton of extraction games, it does seem like more tend towards this severe gear disparity problem than don't. And obviously that is going to make the game severely unbalanced. You're going to have the haves and the have-nots, and anybody jumping into the game fresh is going to be a have-not. Now, on the positive side, most of these games don't seem to be going full-on into pay-to-win territory and just letting you buy the best equipment in the game with real money, so you still have to either get lucky with whatever loot you're finding in the match, or you have to work your way towards it. But you still have a situation in which the individual player's skills simply cannot overcome the gap in the gear that the other player has, regardless of whether they're actually better at the game or not. Now again, this disproportionately affects some games in the extraction genre more than others. In a game like Hunt Showdown, for example, it's barely even a thing at all. It doesn't matter whether you're using a Mosin Nagant or a Winchester 73 that you just got from a random free hunter, you're still going to be able to be effective with it. That is simply not the case in a game like Marauders especially, but also something like Escape from Tarkov, where the gear is incredibly important to how effective you will be in any given match. This, of course, has a few effects. The first is that it makes these games immensely frustrating to new players, because you're just getting absolutely stomped on by players who just have better gear than you, and there's not really much you can do about it. And depending on the game, it might take a lot of grinding to get to the point where you have access to the items that would actually make you competitive with those other players in a manner that's completely independent of player skill. You could be an incredibly talented first-person shooter player, and that will not matter in a game like Marauders, or to a lesser extent Tarkov, because if you're shooting at an enemy who just has better gear than you, then it doesn't matter how good your shot placement is, it doesn't matter how good your recoil management is, they're still just going to survive those shots and end up dropping you because they just have better stuff than you. In order for something like this to actually feel relatively fair, there needs to be some sort of mitigating factor. Something like what Hunt does, where regardless of what you're using, headshots are always lethal. That wouldn't necessarily work in every game, obviously, but it is a mitigating factor that puts the onus more on the player's individual skill, rather than it mostly being a numbers game of gear versus gear. The idea is that while gear might give you some advantage, a savvy and skillful player should be able to overcome that by outplaying the other player, not just be completely at their mercy like they are in something like Marauders. And don't get me wrong, if you're trying to make gear an important mechanical part of your game, then that is going to be something that is very tricky to balance, and I haven't really seen any developer actually manage to do it. Either they just languish in the eternal game of whack-a-mole, trying to constantly beat down whatever is attempting to spring up as the meta, and never actually address the real problem behind it, or they do something like what Hunt Showdown and Call of Duty Warzone's DMZ mode does, where all the equipment is viable. It's really more just a matter of either what the game gives you, or what your personal preferences are, or just what kind of playstyle you're going to end up with. But of course, that latter solution doesn't really help you if you're trying to make a more gear-oriented game like, say, Tarkov, Marauders, etc. So, again, it's just a really tricky thing to balance, and I haven't seen any developer do it so far. And unfortunately, the only thing that kind of balances it out overall is that most of these games have progression wipes. Now, with some of them, like with Marauders, they're only doing it while it's in its early access beta period, or whatever you want to call it. And once the game hits its so-called finished state, then they're going to stop doing progression wipes. At least that's what they say they're going to do. So that somewhat mitigates the problem, at least for the first week or so after the wipe begins, because then everybody's having to go back through the grind again. But after a week or so, the hardcore veteran players who just play these games religiously are going to have all of their high-level gear again, and it's just going to end up being the same mess as before, just postponed by about a week or so. And speaking of progression wipes, that's a whole problem in and of itself. They're another thing that will push newcomers away from games, because people don't like losing their progress. They like being able to just keep playing and not have to worry about losing all of the progress they've made, all of the unlocks, all of the gear, etc., just because the developers decided to wipe everybody's progression at some point. In the case of games like Tarkov or Marauders, they try to justify it as wiping progression whenever there's a significant update so that you can go in and test all the different meta changes and such like that. And while some people might be willing to put up with that during an early access or beta phase, they're not going to be putting up with it after a full release. That, of course, brings me to another problem with the extraction genre, the fact that most of them aren't finished. Now, this isn't necessarily going to apply to Call of Duty Warzone's DMZ mode, because that's just a mode within that game. But in the case of full standalone games, take a look at the full breadth of extraction shooters and extraction action games. With the exception of Hunt Showdown and this game that pretty much nobody has ever heard of called Lost Light, almost every single one of them is either in early access or beta, and has likely been in that state for a long time. I mean, hell, Escape from Tarkov has been in a so-called closed beta for the last 7 years. And frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if they just keep it in a perpetual state of so-called closed beta, just because it's a convenient excuse for any kind of criticism the game might get. Oh, well, this thing is messy right now, but don't worry, it's in closed beta. We'll fix it eventually. When in all likelihood, they either can't because of, say, engine limitations or something like that, and they just don't want to admit that to anyone, or they simply choose not to fix it. And that kind of thing will also drive away newcomers. They'll look at a game, see that it's unfinished, and say, maybe later, and then probably never come back to it, because more likely than not, the game's never actually going to come out of early access, or even if it does, they'll have probably forgotten about it. Not to mention the fact that even for people who do decide to delve into a game when it's in early access, there's only so much you can put up with in terms of glitches, performance issues, other serious technical problems, game imbalancing problems that are all a result of them still trying to work all this stuff out. And for most people, that level of tolerance is going to be quite low. This, of course, is going to sort of indirectly feed into the gear disparity problem when you end up with player population issues. Now, in the bigger games in this genre, like Tarkov and Hunt Showdown, this isn't a problem. In a game like Marauders, on the other hand, which is currently averaging around 200 to 300 players maximum every day, that is a problem, because it means the only people actually left playing it are the high-level players who have all the high-level gear, and thus, if you try to jump in as a newcomer, you have basically no chance regardless of which match you go into. If you just run into another player at all, the chances that they're going to be a super heavy-geared high-level player are nearly 100%, and you just have no chance of defeating them. And of course, they're not going to take pity on you for being a low-level player who just doesn't have access to anything. They're just going to drop you like they would anybody else. And inevitably, if you take to the forums to talk about how much of a problem this is, they're just going to say things like, oh, well, you just need to get good. It has a learning curve. You need to get past the learning curve. When the simple reality is that no amount of getting good is going to make 9mm rounds any more effective against something like a Panzer rig. And the reality is that in any extraction shooter where gear is a major factor, the smaller the player base gets, the more likely it's just going to be composed almost exclusively of those very high-level players who have all of the good stuff, and anybody who tries to jump in is just going to get absolutely bodied by them. This means that for these particular types of extraction games, you're going to have a serious problem once the player base starts to shrink. They really rely on having a decent, at least, sized player base so that people can jump into matches and get a decent spread of people playing it instead of only running into really high-level players. And if that's all you run into in a game like this, then that's just going to make people quit the game incredibly quickly. It just ends up making the player feel like they're entering a hostile environment, like they're trying to get into this game that seems really cool, only to find out that, intentionally or not, the game is outright telling them they're not welcome here. And that is only reinforced by extraction games' all-or-nothing premise. That's really the big draw of the extraction game experience, this all-or-nothing idea. You go into the match with whatever you bring in with you, and you try to scavenge whatever kind of loot you can find, or in the case of a game like Hunt Showdown, you try to hunt down the targets and grab the bounty, and then you make it to the extraction point in one piece, and then reap the rewards of whatever you manage to scavenge in the match. whether that be more powerful weapons or better armor or food or medicine or quest items or whatever it may well be. It's a high-stakes experience. You might find something really good in a match, and then you just immediately go, ooh, I really need to get out of here, and then it's an absolutely harrowing experience trying to get to the extraction point and make it out in one piece, because if you manage to die in the match, then whatever you brought into it and whatever you found while you were in that match is lost. That experience of finding something that you really need to complete a quest, or finding a really good weapon or piece of armor or something along those lines, and then trying to make it to the extraction point in one piece without some other player dropping you and then stealing your loot, or without the AI running around the map dropping you and then you just losing everything. It is a harrowing experience, but it is exhilarating when you manage to make it out of those matches alive. But when you don't make it out of those matches, it can be incredibly frustrating. It's an experience of highs and lows, and those highs are incredibly exhilarating, and those lows are incredibly frustrating, and there's very little in between there. And that's just not going to appeal to a large portion of the gaming public to begin with. But even for the people who are into that style of gameplay, these other problems only get exacerbated by this all-or-nothing gameplay approach. As an example, if the only real defense against somebody with high-level gear is to have high-level gear yourself, how exactly are you supposed to overcome that hurdle if you just jump into a match and every player you encounter is in high-level gear and you're stuck with low-level gear, and they just absolutely stomp on you before you even have a chance to get any high-level gear? Well, the developers of Marauders don't really have an answer for it. They just kind of shrug and say, well, there's Raider mode, you can play that and get some random gear and maybe you'll get lucky. But then you deal with potentially very long wait times in the matchmaking queue, and you also have a cooldown timer on that, so you can't just keep playing Raider mode exclusively. So it's not a solution. At least a game like Tarkov says, well, you can still defeat higher level players with lower level gear if you shoot into the gaps of their armor, or you get really good shot placement with, say, a Mosin Nagant or something like that. It's not much, but it's better than just shrugging and saying, well, just get lucky. And unfortunately, Tarkov is the exception rather than the norm, where most of them do pretty much what Marauders does, which is say, well, you just have to get lucky. Now, in cases where the game's still very early in development, like, say, A Twisted Path to Renown, it makes sense why they don't have something addressing this issue. They're still working on getting the fundamentals in the game implemented properly, so they're obviously not going to start worrying about all of the player experience stuff until they've at least got all the fundamentals set up. But for the games that have been out for a few years at this point, whether it's in early access or not, there's not really an excuse. They should have recognized this as a problem and then implemented at least something to try to address it. It may not necessarily have to be the best solution ever if the game's still in active development, but at the very least they should have picked up on it being a problem and implemented at least something to make it obvious that they are aware of the problem and are working on solutions for it. Again, this is one of those things that will drive a player away from an extraction game, and since I've already talked about how having a healthy player base is absolutely vital for an extraction game, they should be doing whatever they can to retain player numbers, and unfortunately a lot of them just don't take any steps to ensure that. And that just feeds into what I'm calling the curse of early access, which is something that plagues the gaming industry in general, but it's especially bad in extraction games, because while it's certainly incredibly annoying when it happens to a single-player game, whenever it happens to a multiplayer game, especially one as heavily reliant on a healthy player base as extraction games, it's a serious problem. Let me explain a bit more about what I'm talking about here. Whenever there is a pre-release build of something, whether it's called early access or open or closed beta or alpha or whatever, that is made available to the general public, is meant to assist in the development process. The developers are trying to get their game out into the hands of players who aren't necessarily thinking the way these developers are, so they get to mess around with things, find out how things are broken, find out how things can be exploited, find out what the problem points are, whether it be technical issues or mechanical issues or just user experience problems or whatever the case may be, and then using the feedback they get from the players, they can make the game better. And in the case of something like the early access program on Steam, it's also a way of generating more revenue that can then be used to fund the development of the game. That's how this is all supposed to work, but unfortunately There has been a twisting of this methodology over the past couple of decades, so that beta basically means glorified demo for a AAA game, for example, and a game releasing into early access effectively becomes the release of a game because it just never actually ends up being finished. After all, if the game is still in early access, the developers can just explain away all of its problems with, oh yeah, it's in early access, we'll get to it eventually, or it just never actually gets finished because the developer ends up shutting down for one reason or another, or they just outright abandon the project. And this sort of thing happens with enough regularity that I term it the curse of early access. If a game launches into early access and gets finished and released into full 1.0 or whatever the version they're calling it is, then that's great. It's what early access periods are intended to be. However, if it's one of those games where updates start becoming fewer and further between, the developers become increasingly less communicative over time, major issues go unaddressed for weeks, months, or even years, and eventually those updates just stop entirely and the developer ceases all communication, or maybe even just give you the courtesy of saying that they're abandoning the project, well, that particular game has fully succumbed to the curse of early access. Now, to give you an example of the curse of early access in action, I have to turn back to Marauders here. So, the game launched into early access back in October of 2022, and for the next couple of months, things are looking pretty solid. You got some hot fixes, you got regular communication from the developers, you get a major update in the form of the Red Baron update in December of 2022, and then, of course, there are a few updates and blog posts along the way there. And then at the end of January 2023, they post another dev blog, and then it becomes radio silent until February 23rd, at which point they release a hotfix for the Red Baron update, and then they do another one the following day, and then another one on March 1st, and then they go radio silent again until April 20th of 2023, at which point they say the United Allies update is coming April 25th. It does release on April 25th, and then the following day it gets a hotfix update, followed by another couple of hotfixes in May, and about the middle of May it seems like communication is starting to resume. We get another dev blog, we get a Gun Insider post talking about the Stoner 63, we get a notification of the merch store going live, and then radio silence until June 29th, at which point they announce the date that the Excavation update is going to release, which then releases on July 4th, and communication resumes. And then it gets pretty consistent again until you get to September 20th of 2023, at which point radio silence resumes until November 15th, at which point they give a development update on the Guild's update that's going to be releasing soonish. It finally releases into the playtest servers on November 30th, and then communication resumes again until you get to the Guild's update releasing in full on December 14th, and then we get another hotfix on December 20th and radio silence until February 8th of this year, at which point they talk about their next update, Retribution. Then the Guild's update gets a patch in the middle of March, and then the next thing we get from them is a notification that the Retribution update is going to be delayed, and that's on May 7th. And then finally we get more communication about the Retribution update on August 2nd, and the update itself releases on August 16th. And since then, absolutely nothing. No hotfix updates, no hey, this is what we're working on, no dev blogs, nothing since the Retribution update released. And while I understand they're probably working behind the scenes on stuff and they're just waiting to post an update until they have something substantial to provide, this pattern they've been showing of increasing time between updates and poor communication makes an extremely poor impression not only on people who might be looking into the game to see if it's something worth trying, but also on people who already bought into the game but quit playing it because of issues it had and were waiting for those issues to be fixed. And to give you an idea of just how ridiculously poor the communication from Marauders developers are, if you look on the game's official website right now, it's still just saying that the Plunder update is out right now. The Plunder update was launched in August of 2023. That is 2 major updates ago, and they still haven't updated the game's main website. Obviously, that is an extremely bad look for the game. If somebody who doesn't know any better hops onto the game's website to check it out and they see that the last major update, according to the website, was back in August of last year, then they might just assume the game is abandoned or the development cycle is obnoxiously slow and say, you know what, maybe I shouldn't play this thing. Again, contributing to the population issue. And then on top of all of this, there is one particularly nasty problem that plagues the entire gaming industry at this point, especially first-person shooters, but it's especially terrible in extraction shooters because of their all-or-nothing gameplay style, and that is cheaters. You see, cheaters have utterly infested multiplayer gaming at this point, regardless of genre, but it's especially common in first-person shooters, and in extraction games it is especially bad, again, because of the all-or-nothing gameplay style. If you're playing, say, Call of Duty and you run into a guy who's blatantly aimbotting or whatever, then that's irritating, but you can always just leave that match, wait for a bit, hop back into the matchmaking queue, and find a different match that doesn't have a cheater in it. You don't really lose anything other than some time. In an extraction shooter, on the other hand, you stand to lose whatever gear you brought into a match, and whatever loot you might be able to find. Now, it is considerably less severe in games that aren't as loot or gear based, like, say, Hunt Showdown or Call of Duty Warzone's DMZ mode or something like that, but it is still incredibly irritating because you do still lose something. After all, in a game like Hunt, you still lose your hunter with all of the traits that they had unlocked and whatever gear they happened to be carrying. And replacing those things can be quite time-consuming and expensive. In a more gear-driven game like Tarkov or Marauders or something along those lines, that is considerably amplified. And to put it simply, it can be incredibly frustrating when you get dropped by a player who's just playing it legit. But if a cheater does it to you, then that's just downright infuriating. And unfortunately, every developer of any kind of online game is just going to be caught in an eternal game of whack-a-mole when it comes to cheaters. They do what they can, they implement what anti-cheat measures they can, but no matter how intrusive those measures are, cheaters will just always find a way around it. About the only thing that actually works, and has been proven to work for a long time, is community-run dedicated servers with admins who actively ban anyone who's cheating. And while a solution like that will work for most first-person shooters, it's not necessarily going to work with an extraction shooter. I don't really see a situation in which an extraction shooter can really work with community-run servers, simply because of how much has to remain persistent across multiple servers. So you're probably going to ask at this point, well, what kind of solution would actually work for a game like this? Well, unfortunately, nothing is going to be completely foolproof. There will always be cheaters slipping through the cracks who are able to keep things subtle enough that you really can't tell they're cheating. Well, at that point, it becomes a matter of player reporting and developer action, and those things almost never actually line up. It really doesn't help that nearly all of these extraction games do not offer any sort of spectating functionality that allows you to watch someone as they're playing and see if they're doing things that are suspicious, which you can then report them for. And I can't think of a single extraction game that offers a replay functionality like with the kill cam system in Call of Duty, where you can see exactly what they were doing when they dropped you. So being able to record video proof of someone cheating in these games is often remarkably difficult, and even if you do somehow manage to get video proof of them cheating, then it's up to the developers to act on those reports, and more often than not, the developers are very quiet about anything they're doing in that sense. Now, I can certainly see being tight-lipped about any kind of anti-cheat measures you have in place and what your methodology is behind the scenes, because obviously revealing any of that information to the general public is going to give cheaters more information that they can then use to circumvent your measures. But when even obvious cheaters go weeks, months, or even indefinitely without getting banned, that just leaves the players wondering what the hell is going on and getting increasingly frustrated with it. I mean, after all, if these cheaters are just running around rampant, then is the anti-cheat software doing anything? Well, I can tell you that the kernel-level anti-cheats, which are most of the big anti-cheats these days, are at the very least providing potential threat vectors for bad actors to exploit if a vulnerability vulnerability is ever discovered in those anti-cheat softwares, and they can just deploy some sort of malware into it that will then infect your system and allow them to do whatever the hell they want to it. They are at the very least doing that, and we even have recent precedents for this happening. I mean, there was that anti-cheat bundled with Genshin Impact that a malware group managed to exploit and used to deploy ransomware to a bunch of people's computers. And again, most of the big anti-cheats these days are kernel level, so if the vulnerability is there, then it can be exploited to the same degree. Whether it's the in-house anti-cheats like Riot's Vanguard, or Activision's Ricochet, or EA's anti-cheat, or the more widely deployed solutions like Easy Anti-Cheat, BattlEye, Denuvo Anti-Cheat, or the now rather infamous InProtect GameGuard, which outright is described as a rootkit, or even the one that people will remember if they played a lot of first-person shooters and such in the early 2000s, Punkbuster. A lot of people forget that one was kernel level. Regardless of which one it is, technically they need to be at kernel level to perform operations like memory scanning and such, which is how they try to detect cheats. But at the same time, if it ever gets compromised, then that is a massive threat vector for your system, and cheaters are constantly poking at these anti-cheats, trying to find ways around the detection, and trying to find exploits that they can use with them. So it's really only a matter of time until a significant enough vulnerability is discovered in these other big anti-cheats and then subsequently exploited. And all that for something that cheaters have found a way around anyway, and so you still run into plenty of cheaters, even in games that are supposedly secured by these kernel-level anti-cheats. So then you have the confirmation bias of, well, if the kernel-level anti-cheat is barely doing anything at all, if it even is doing anything at all, then what about the developer response? Well, if they're not posting ban wave numbers, if they're not posting information about how many cheaters they're actually getting, if you're not receiving confirmations that your report of a particular player you suspected of cheating ended up leading to a ban, then players have absolutely no idea what the developers are actually doing about cheaters, if they're actually doing anything about them at all. Since that kind of stuff is all handled behind the scenes, we really have no way of knowing if they're doing anything about cheaters, and if they are actually doing anything about it, what they're doing about them. Lack of communication from the developers only helps to exacerbate the problem. People get the perception that either the developers can't, or just simply choose not to do anything about the cheating problem, which in turn further degrades people's confidence in the developer and the game they're making, which in turn feeds back into all the other problems that the game has. So extraction games end up in this incredibly frustrating feedback loop of all of these issues compounding on each other, pushing the casuals out, pushing even the general audience intended for that game out, because they simply don't want to deal with all of this crap. They don't want to have their progression wiped every so often. They don't want to be constantly running into high-level players that they can't really do anything against, simply because they're low-level players. They certainly don't want to be losing characters, gear, or loot to cheaters, and they want to see the game actually making progress to a properly finished state, at which point anything beyond that would just be adding more content, maybe more features beyond what the original vision was, instead of not hearing anything from the developers for weeks or months until finally they get an update that just adds a bit of content and doesn't actually fix any of the major issues that the game has. And when a huge number of players are actively being turned away from a game that relies on a healthy player base as much as an extraction game does, that is going to be a serious problem both for the longevity of the project and for anybody who still wants to play that experience, unless, of course, the game has some sort of dedicated PvE mode, like, say, PvE Tarkov. But unfortunately, PvE modes are just not really a thing in this genre right now. The only other game that has a dedicated PvE mode is Incursion Red River, which is entirely PvE. There's no PvP mode at all. The problem with it, though, is that it released into early access in a very early stage of development, so it barely has any content right now, and thus is something you can't really recommend to anybody unless they want to directly fund the development of it. And now we're back at the curse of early access. It's just this infinite feedback loop of problems feeding into other problems, and ultimately you just end up back where you started. It makes the entire subtype of extraction games incredibly frustrating to think about, because on the one hand you do have that very unique feeling of highs and lows that you really don't get with other types of action games. But you have this effectively infinite feedback loop of these problems constantly feeding into each other, and eventually it will just wear you down, no matter how much you like the premise of extraction games, because it is a really strong premise. And when everything's firing on all cylinders, it can be really fun. But when things aren't firing on all cylinders, it can be immensely frustrating or even downright infuriating, and there's very little in between there. And for most players, the frustration and infuriation side is going to vastly outweigh the fun side. And so unless the problems that create such an infuriating feedback loop are fixed, or at least ameliorated, extraction games just aren't going to be able to realize their full potential. And people who otherwise might have thoroughly enjoyed a particular extraction game will continue to be turned away from it. Thank you all for watching. Originally, I was just going to make a video that was talking about the update to Marauders, and now it has spiraled off into something else entirely here. Regardless of where it started out, I hope you at least found the video informative or entertaining, and I'd like to thank you again for watching. If you like my content, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine. I understand. But the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really helps out. You'd be amazed how even $1 a month can help out. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.